Who built the most advanced tomato factory in Burkina Faso without a single dollar from the IMF, USAID, or the EU? A leaked internal map from the Ministry of Agriculture shows something astonishing. In one of the poorest corners of Bobo Dioulasso, a small industrial zone has quietly emerged, complete with a factory, cold storage, and underground water lines, all built without foreign loans. No Western ambassador at the ribbon cutting. No EU flags flapping in the wind. Just Burkinabe engineers, masons, welders, and farmers, building with their own hands, from bricks to steel to bottle labels. They said, "Burkina Faso can't." They laughed when Traoré spoke of turning crops into exports. And yet, today, bright red jars of tomato paste labeled "Made in Faso" are rolling off the line without a single foreign consultant in sight. So why hasn't CNN reported this? Who's trying to hide it? Buckle up, because this story isn't just about tomatoes, it's about a quiet rebellion shaking the pillars of dependency. On the 22nd of July, 2025, Radio Omega and La Faso reported a remarkable event. In Bobo Dioulasso, a tomato processing plant built entirely by Burkinabe engineers, funded without foreign assistance, has officially begun operations. Costing 12 million CFA francs, the factory sources tomatoes directly from local farmers and employs over 120 workers, mainly women and youth. And this news may sound small on a global scale, but for Burkina Faso, a country often boxed into dependency, it marks something greater than industry. It's an act of economic defiance, a quiet revolution sealed in glass jars and wrapped in national dignity. The rooms smelled like dust and diesel. It was 6 months before the factory would open, and President Ibrahim Traoré stood in silence inside an abandoned textile warehouse on the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso. His boots echoed across the cracked concrete floor as he ran his hand over rusted pipes and shattered glass. Behind him, 3 ministers whispered nervously. One of them finally spoke. "Excellency, this is not viable. We don't have the budget. The World Bank will..." Traoré raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "We will not borrow what we can build. We will not beg for machines when our youth are unemployed. If we do not believe in ourselves, no one ever will." The words didn't boom. They burned, slow and deep, because Traoré wasn't speaking to his ministers. He was speaking to centuries of doubt that lived in the walls. The same doubt that had kept Burkina Faso importing tomato paste from Europe, while its own crops rotted in the sun. It wasn't just about tomatoes, it was about memory, about mothers who stirred sauce with empty wallets, about farmers who sold their produce for pennies while shelves were filled with foreign goods, about a country bleeding wealth every time it opened a supermarket door. So Traoré made a vow, right there in the dust. "We will build this factory," he said. "No IMF, no USAID, no conditional aid, only Burkinabe. We will fail, perhaps, but we will fail free." What followed was a storm. Western envoys arrived unannounced. Meetings were called, letters sent, threats disguised as economic recommendations. They warned him of unsustainable investments and regional instability. One ambassador even offered to partner on the project, meaning control, not support. But Traoré had made his decision. He turned to his engineers, welders, architects, and farmers, not to financiers. And they responded. Hundreds volunteered. Families pooled money. Local co-ops offered land. A retired Burkinabe inventor donated the design for an energy-efficient boiler built using scrap parts from a disassembled French water pump. Brick by brick, gear by gear, the impossible began to rise. They worked under lantern light. Women peeled tomatoes by hand, while young men wired circuits from salvaged parts. There were no official permits, no bureaucratic chains, only unity, urgency, and the hum of self-determination. Every setback became a lesson. When the first conveyor belt failed, a mechanic from Ouagadougou redesigned it, using bicycle chains. When electricity cut out, a local blacksmith built a backup generator powered by cooking oil. Soon, the community wasn't just watching, they were building it. Children skipped school to help carry bricks. Grandmothers brought tea to welders at midnight. Even soldiers stationed nearby took shifts mixing concrete. The project was no longer about a factory. It had become a symbol, a battlefield without bullets, where every nail driven was a strike against dependency. Meanwhile, the outside world began to whisper. In foreign boardrooms, reports emerged of unapproved industrial activity in Burkina Faso. Analysts couldn't explain how the country, under President Ibrahim Traoré, was developing infrastructure without external finance. Some suspected Russian backing. Others thought it was a PR stunt. But none could believe the truth, that Africa, in its most underestimated corner, was choosing to rise alone. Then came the sabotage. A fire broke out one night in the engine room. Investigators found traces of accelerant. The local police chief, a French-trained officer, called it an electrical accident. But the workers knew better. They rebuilt in silence, mourning nothing but their patience. For them, the fire proved one thing: they were being watched. But Traoré never flinched. He visited the site 2 days later, walked through the charred walls, and addressed the workers like soldiers. They will burn our wires. They will bribe our own. But they cannot kill a people who have chosen to stand. This factory is not mine. It is yours. It is Burkina Faso's. Cheers erupted. Not choreographed, not televised, just raw, defiant joy. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the factory, but in the soul of a nation. The Burkinabe no longer waited for opportunity to arrive. They built it, with calloused hands and blistered hope. By the end of that month, production began. And no one from Paris, Washington, or Brussels had any part in it. The factory walls were still warm from the first run when the second battle began, the economic one. International suppliers, suddenly realizing Burkina Faso no longer needed their imported tomato paste, began slashing prices. Overnight, crates from Italy and Spain flooded West African markets at half the cost, a price far below production. Promotional aid, they called it, but everyone in Bobo Dioulasso knew the game: undercut the Burkinabe, crush the local dream. President Ibrahim Traoré saw it clearly. They do not compete, he told his cabinet. They conquer. A special council was convened, not economists in suits, but village elders, cooperative leaders, women from the markets. For the first time in decades, policy wasn't dictated by foreign advisors in air-conditioned towers, but by the hands that harvested the fruit. One elder stood and asked, "If we cannot sell, what do we eat?" A market woman followed, "If they crush this, they will crush the next dream too." Traoré nodded. "Then we protect this with law and heart." In a historic move, the government introduced the Burkinabe Agricultural Sovereignty Act, banning subsidized foreign tomato imports and granting tax breaks to local vendors carrying domestically processed goods. It wasn't just protectionism, it was preservation. Western news outlets screamed, "Burkina Faso closes markets. Populist president threatens trade balance." But inside the country, the headlines read differently. "Burkinabe feed Burkinabe. The red gold stays home." Farmers across the country responded by tripling tomato cultivation. Young engineers in Ouagadougou designed mobile processing units. A university in Ouagadougou launched a research program for sustainable packaging. What began as one factory became an ecosystem, rooted in independence, nourished by unity. Still, the pressure mounted. Foreign diplomats warned of sanctions. Aid packages were delayed. Certain NGOs quietly shut down operations. Yet, through it all, the people held the line, not with weapons, but with loyalty, because something deeper had shifted. This wasn't about one man, or one building, or one vegetable. This was about Burkina Faso choosing to live with less, if it meant standing tall, choosing to eat one meal a day, if that meal was earned, not gifted, choosing to belong to themselves again. Inside the gates of the tomato factory, the air had changed. The walls were painted with local murals, not logos. Baskets of tomatoes arrived in donkey carts, pickup trucks, even bicycles. Women lined the sorting tables with music playing softly in the background, griot ballads about resistance, about home. There were no uniforms, no ID badges, only headscarves, sweat, and pride. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, analysts were baffled. How does Burkina Faso, landlocked, aid-dependent, politically unstable, pull off industrial growth without us? One European trade officer asked at a Geneva summit. The answer was simple: because they were never invited to the table, so they built their own. Ibrahim Traoré was not trying to provoke the West, but he was no longer willing to appease it either. His speeches grew more direct, more philosophical. At a press event, when asked if his agricultural policy risked isolation, he replied, "If a man stands alone because he refuses to kneel, is he isolated or is he sovereign?" It was no longer just about tomatoes. All across Africa, whispers grew louder. Ghanaian youth posted photos in support. "We want our own factory." Tanzanian engineers offered blueprints. Malian farmers asked for seed exchanges. For the first time in decades, a landlocked country with no oil, no global leverage, no celebrity backing, had become the spark of a regional reawakening. But Traoré stayed grounded. He continued visiting villages, holding town halls, inspecting irrigation ditches, and publicly publishing every dollar spent from the factory's revenues. Transparency wasn't a PR stunt. It was his weapon against internal corruption and external propaganda. And yet, even as the harvest doubled and shelves filled with local jars, one problem remained: the silence. Major African news outlets covered celebrity scandals. Western media dismissed the story as agrarian populism. Traoré's revolution was too quiet, too pure, too homegrown to be sensational. But it didn't need noise. It had momentum. The next storm came not from diplomats or trade deals, but from within. As the factory's success grew, so did the ambitions of men who saw power in its wake. A former minister, once loyal, began rallying discontented elites. Rumors spread: Traoré is hoarding profits. The factory is a front for military control. Freedom is just another kind of tyranny. These whispers slithered through the capital's cafes, into foreign embassies, and eventually onto international blogs. President Ibrahim Traoré knew what was happening. He'd read this chapter before, written in the fall of Thomas Sankara, in coups dressed as course corrections, in African dreams strangled by internal betrayal, but this time he was ready. He called a national assembly, not behind closed doors, but in a dusty open-air stadium in Ouagadougou under the sun. Farmers, students, workers, and veterans sat shoulder to shoulder with officials and skeptics. Cameras rolled. No script, no security curtain. And Traoré spoke. If this factory is a threat, it is not to Burkina Faso, but to dependency. If this leadership is dangerous, it is not because it silences the people, but because it reminds them they have a voice. A hush fell. Even critics could not deny the symbolism. He then opened the books. On screen, line by line, every transaction. Salary distributions, maintenance costs, community reinvestment, surplus allocation to education and health. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was enough. The people roared in approval, not just of the numbers, but of the daring, the idea that a leader could trust his citizens more than he feared them. But the opposition wasn't done. That night, documents leaked to an international wire claimed that the tomato factory had received covert Chinese investment. Within hours, the headlines spun. Is Traoré truly independent? Or just changing masters? Burkina Faso's tomato factory? A red flag in disguise? Western influencers latched on. Podcasts, Twitter spaces, panels, all speculating, but none citing fact. The next morning, Traoré walked to the factory gates alone, live streaming from his phone. No Chinese funds, no Russian wires, no French cuts, just our tomatoes, just our people. Come see. And tens of thousands did. By noon, the gates of the tomato factory were overflowing, not with tourists, but with citizens. Mothers with their children, elders leaning on canes, students skipping lectures, farmers in dusty boots, all came to witness the truth with their own eyes. Inside, the hum of machines continued uninterrupted, steam hissing from the sterilizers, the scent of slow-cooked tomato thick in the air. No foreign banners, no armed guards, just workers, working. Outside, a woman in her 60s held a sign written in charcoal. "I don't care who doubts Traoré. I've tasted the change." The message went viral. That week, Traoré's live stream was replayed on local television, WhatsApp groups, and street corner screens across Burkina Faso and neighboring nations. Not a polished documentary, not a Western journalist's voiceover, just a man, a phone, and the simple act of showing the world what had been denied for generations: that Africa can build on its own. Behind closed doors, panic spread. Multinational corporations that once dismissed Burkina Faso as a non-player began reassessing. Regional elites who had mocked Traoré's tomato dream suddenly grew quiet. And in Washington, a classified report from a West Africa analyst began with 6 words: "Traoré has made self-reliance contagious." But the pressure didn't stop. It evolved. Hackers targeted the factory's supply chain systems. Foreign NGOs started investigations into labor conditions. International banks quietly blacklisted Burkinabe export requests. And yet, the tomatoes kept rolling. In response, Traoré launched the Burkina Sovereignty Fund, inviting diaspora Burkinabe across the globe to invest not in profits, but in pride. And they did. Teachers from Atlanta wired in savings. Taxi drivers in Paris gave monthly pledges. A retired nurse in Toronto donated half her pension. The message was clear: we believe, and we will not wait for the world to validate us. In less than 2 months, the fund surpassed its goal. New processing equipment was ordered from Tunisia, not Europe. Solar panels were installed. A second factory site was chosen near Kaya. The movement had outgrown the factory. It had become a philosophy, one that spread not through speeches, but through jars. Jars of sauce, sealed with red lids and stamped with a simple label: "Made in Burkina Faso by Burkinabe." Then came the twist that no one, not even Traoré, saw coming. In late July 2025, a whistleblower from inside a major European agribusiness conglomerate leaked documents to an independent journalist based in Senegal. The files contained detailed communications between executives and foreign diplomats. The content? A coordinated strategy to flood West African markets with subsidized tomato paste, destroy local production, and reassert control over emerging agro-industries. The whistleblower's exact words: "Burkina Faso is the test case. If it succeeds, others will follow. We must shut it down by price or by politics." The documents also revealed covert funding to local opposition figures in Burkina Faso, including plans to stage a protest labeling Traoré as anti-progress and a threat to international cooperation. Worse still, there were outlines of proposed tariffs on any Burkinabe agricultural exports labeled non-compliant with international standards. The story exploded. Within hours, African media outlets ran headlines that hadn't been seen in decades. Burkina Faso targeted for independence, and corporate colonialism exposed. But what shocked the world most was how Traoré responded. He didn't accuse, he didn't rage. He walked to the tomato field just behind the factory, picked up a ripe fruit, held it in front of the cameras, and said, "They wage war with paperwork. We reply with proof. Taste this. It is ours." No script, no teleprompter, just the earth, the harvest, and a truth too simple to be buried. That one clip, Traoré holding a tomato, speaking with nothing but dignity and dirt on his fingers, traveled further than any official press release ever could. Within days, Africans from Lagos to Nairobi began posting videos of their own. Farmers raised their cassavas, fishermen held up their catch, seamstresses showed off handmade clothes. Each post carried the same caption: "We reply with proof." The continent had found its quiet, rallying cry. In a rare move, several African heads of state is usually cautious about publicly aligning with populist figures, issued statements defending Burkina Faso's right to economic sovereignty. The African Union, under pressure from its own youth, called an emergency session to review foreign trade imbalances and the protection of indigenous industries. But the most unexpected shift came from inside the West. Independent American journalists, largely ignored by legacy networks, began dissecting the leaked documents. One podcast, hosted by a retired CIA analyst, described the situation not as a rebellion, but as a reset. Burkina Faso isn't fighting the West, he said. It's fighting the ghost of an old world order, and winning. Soon after, a group of African-American entrepreneurs launched the Diaspora Trade Alliance, pledging to distribute Burkinabe tomato products across U.S. cities, starting with community markets in Atlanta, Detroit, and Baltimore. Traoré's image, humble, firm, and unshaken, now hung on murals, T-shirts, and posters across continents, not as a savior, but as a symbol of something long overdue, a leader who didn't ask for pity, a country that didn't wait for permission, a people that refused to sell their pride for packaged aid. Today, the sun rises differently over Burkina Faso. The hum of the tomato factory is joined by the rhythm of new workshops, village labs, school gardens, and youth cooperatives. Children no longer learn only about Europe's industrial revolutions, they visit one their parents helped build. Women who once stood in line for foreign aid now stand at the head of distribution tables, signing invoices for shipments bound for Bamako, Accra, and beyond. The shelves of local markets tell a story written not in ink but in jars. Made in Burkina Faso, by Burkinabe. For Africa, President Ibrahim Traoré stands where Sankara once stood, but this time with a generation at his back. Not because he promised wealth, but because he awakened will. And when asked by a foreign reporter what he learned from the factory that defied the world, Traoré answered, "We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up to win it." Let that be remembered. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré touches your heart, share this story. Subscribe to this channel and join the journey of an Africa that no longer bows its head. God bless Africa. Is this the future you've been waiting for?